Let me call this meeting to order.
Okay.
Let me call this meeting to order of the Village Parking Committee. You will take the minutes, Amy, and record who is in attendance so that we have record of that. I do want to say the last set of minutes was very mature. One of the items on our agenda is that we view the last meeting minutes. Everyone has been sent those. They were a little bit late, but at least everyone should have had the chance to read them. And I'm asking at this point, given the minutes that were recorded, does anyone have any questions about the content of those minutes? Anything that you heard that you want an explanation of? I'd like to spend a few minutes because it's important that we do these meetings, and when we say we approve the minutes, it is really important to note that these minutes have been approved by a majority for going back and having record of what we have approved as opposed to what's still outstanding. So anyone have any questions? There have been questions about the process. There have been questions about the content of what we're supposed to do. What is our mission? We've addressed those in previous minutes. So I'm asking, is there anything that you want to discuss on this? I noticed there's an attachment about the parking regulations that was attached with this.
I think I have a question.
Pardon me?
There? I think
Yes,
I
I
have a
have,
question.
Tracy.
I was reading through, I don't know what page it is. It's the second page, a small area plan. I don't understand, I don't know, maybe it's just me. Mr. Bechtel reviewed the goals for the village node that were developed by the steering committee, yada, yada, yada. It said he then reviewed the parking related actions that were included in the village node chapter. Those actions include reducing the amount of off-street parking oh, I got it. I got it.
You sure you got it?
I wasn't reading it right.
Okay, this is why we do this, just to make sure you're in touch. No, I'm just kidding you, Tracy. Any other questions, comments? I know, Cheryl, you had a question about why are we doing this? And I was hoping that was answered. What our mission was. I remember last meeting, I think we talked about that a little bit. We did have this presentation from Mark and Todd, mostly Mark derived at Todd's assistance about the village, the small area plan. It was a very good presentation. Okay, so I needed a motion to approve the minutes. Don't be shy.
I moved to approve the minutes.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
I knew you would, Robin. We have a motion and second. All those in favor of approval of the minutes as written, say aye.
Aye.
Same sign if you disagree. Okay, they're approved unanimously, so we can move on. And this is kind of the exciting part. I'm really looking forward to this meeting because of what Mark and Amy and the township has done. So the next item on the agenda is research from some exploration of other communities. And I think that the input here and the takeaway we can talk about after Mark or Todd do their presentation. But I think hopefully there's some things that we can look at and apply here to the village of Ballsburg. So Mark, I think you're on.
Thank you, Bob. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. I have put together a PowerPoint presentation that I hope will adequately summarize what was in the memo that was included in your packet. We spent quite a bit of time looking at some other communities, mostly those that were recommended by the committee, as well as some that staff was aware of. So what I'm going to do, hopefully this will start going to the next slide for me. There we go. So we looked at a total of 12 municipalities. 8 of those are boroughs and 4 are townships that have villages in them that are similar to Boalsburg. 8 of these municipalities utilize commercial zoning to regulate their downtown areas. Generally, those commercial districts permit higher density development, including both commercial and residential uses. 4 of these municipalities utilize a quasi-residential commercial zoning that's more similar to what we have in the village district. The village district in Harris Township has primarily residential and some commercial uses, but the intent of the district is residential according to the township's ordinance. Most of these municipalities have parking requirements that are very similar to Harris Township in the sense that when a new use is established, you need to provide parking for that use. If you're converting a home to something else, you have to bring additional parking into the equation to make sure you're meeting the requirements of the ordinance. There were some exceptions that I'll certainly end up talking about as I go through the presentation. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single one of these municipalities, but I am going to talk about boroughs, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of the townships, and I'm going to actually highlight a few of them and talk a little bit about how they handle their parking. So in terms of boroughs, we looked at 8 of these. Generally speaking, all of these municipalities have much higher population densities than what you find in Boalsburg and in Harris Township in general. As you can see on this table, I listed the size of each of these communities in square miles, as well as their populations. In some cases, these municipalities, even though they're much smaller than Harris Township and even kind of the Boalsburg developed area, they have populations that exceed that of the entire township. Just for reference purposes, Harris Township currently has a population of about 5,900 people. And you can see that some of these municipalities have just under 10,000 in the case of Lidditz. But the area of Harris Township is 31 square miles. So obviously a lot bigger than these communities. And even if we look at the area around Boalsburg, including Kaywood and some of the other developments, we'd still be talking about 5 or so, maybe 6 square miles in area. So generally speaking, these communities are very dense. They have an urban core that is bigger than what we have in Harris Township. These 8 communities were the ones that all utilize commercial zoning for their downtown areas to kind of continue that urban character that they have. And some of these municipalities have very large and deep lots that are capable of supporting off-street parking. In addition, these communities generally have wider streets and rights of way, allowing for on-street parking. That applies to not only their main streets, but a lot of their side streets as well. So you have residential neighborhoods that are just one block away from the downtown area that have parking up and down the streets. There's a number of communities that have private lots, public surface lots, and or parking garages. One other key characteristic is they're all very well developed in terms of their pedestrian facilities. So they're very walkable. You can get from a residential neighborhood a couple blocks away to the downtown area by just walking. And a few of them also have public transit. Several of these municipalities do permit parking reductions in a variety of ways, and some also permit off-site parking and shared parking with restrictions. So I wanted to talk about a couple of them and just go over some of their basic characteristics. I thought I'd start with one that we hopefully are all familiar with, which is Bellefonte here in Center County. Bellefonte obviously is a lot bigger than Boalsburg. It has that urban kind of mixed use downtown, and it is governed by a central business district zoning. So Bellefonte has both on-street and surface parking lots, which provide some relief to local businesses in terms of where people can park to go and visit. There are parking reductions for certain uses in the downtown. That is in part because they have on-street parking and parking lots, but also my understanding is that was partially a tool to try to recruit and hopefully have more development in their downtown area to try to revitalize. Certainly there's uses that bring people into a downtown. Restaurants is a good example. When there's a restaurant, people will come in and they might shop at other places that are there as well. They do permit shared and off-site parking, but they have some restrictions for those. And I wanted to show just, again, I'm certain we've all been to Bellefonte, but you can see here in the street view, they have these wide streets. parking on both sides. And then we have these municipal lots. This is an example of one behind the First National Bank that has, I believe, upwards of 60 spaces in it for visitors to park in. The next community that I'm going to talk a little bit about is Doylestown down in Bucks County. This is the county seat for Bucks County and serves as a bedroom community for Philadelphia. It's located along a SEPTA train line, so you can catch the train to go into Philadelphia, and you can also catch, a bus. There's public transit in Doylestown as well. And this is one of the communities that I ended up reaching out to and having a conversation with their staff, as well as with the staff of the Bucks County parking office, which maintains 2 parking garages in Doylestown. So their downtown has historically been mixed use, has an urban character to it, and is zoned central commercial. They do have reduced parking for retail and some other uses just in this downtown area. So where they have their commercial core, where you have the highest density of commercial uses, they have it where they have a reduced parking requirement. They permit shared and off-site parking with criteria. And generally, when I spoke to their staff, they said that they have very little residential to non-residential conversion in this area. For the most part, the first floor of these buildings were constructed with the intent of being non-residential. Historically, they were probably used as shops historically. And anytime someone does come in to convert any type of use, whether it be a commercial to another commercial use or residential to non-residential, they need to meet the parking requirements. Now, they said they do what they can to try to work with businesses and help them find parking elsewhere in the community that they might be able to share or locate off-site. But they acknowledge that parking is an issue even with the number of garages and municipal surface lots they have. And they also said that administration of some of the off-site and shared parking can be challenging because they have so many businesses that have entered into leases with parking off-site that the municipality has kind of lost track of them. So they said they wouldn't be surprised if some parking spaces have been leased by 4 or 5 different groups or businesses, and they're all paying a lease on the same space, which really kind of defeats the purpose of leasing a space for your customers. So just to give you some street view here, this is what Doylestown, they're a shot from East State Street. You can see the parking on both sides of the street and kind of the general, small city urban type character that it has. They have a nice parking map on their website, trying to direct people where to park. I want to just call out here, number 6 is their one of their parking garages. It has 1,200 spaces. And then this one down here, number 8, has 153 spaces. And both of those garages are actually maintained and owned by Bucks County. And they were built to support the courthouse, which is here, and the Justice Center, which is here. So essentially, they put in these parking spaces to meet their parking requirements for these government facilities. Number 8 down here is only available to the public after 5 o'clock. And number 6 is available to the public at any time, but it's clearly a couple blocks away from the downtown area. So it's obviously a nice amenity for Doylestown, and for visitors, they can stop and visit those parking garages if they need to. Obviously, as shown on that map, there's a lot of other parking available either through surface lots or metered parking along the street. The next community I want to talk a little bit about was Kennett Square in Chester County. It has a smaller downtown area than Bellefonte and Doylestown, but it still has that kind of urban style development, and it's also zoned commercial. They do have on-street parking, municipal surface lots, as well as a parking garage available. They also allow for off-site and some shared parking. There's different restrictions in Kennett Square that are a little more strict. And they do have parking reductions permitted if it's documented and demonstrated by the applicant. So in other words, if a business that's coming in, they have some traffic studies and other information showing that their particular business will require less parking, they have it reviewed by the traffic engineer, and they can have a reduction approved if they meet all those requirements. So here's a street view of Kennett Square. You can see again, it's not necessarily tall buildings, but they're very close together. Has more of that urban character to it, along with a lot of side street parking here. This is a map from Kennett Square's website of where you can park. They have this parking garage that has, I can't remember how many spaces it has, but at least a couple hundred, I believe. And then they have these surface lots as well as a lot of on-street parking. And this is a picture of their parking garage that they have. It's multiple levels. And then the last borough that I'm going to talk about is Lidditz in Lancaster County. This community is about 10 miles north of Lancaster. It has a historical mixed-use urban core that's actually surrounded by a lot of very densely developed residential areas and some industrial areas. It's zoned general commercial, and it's also in two overlays. One is a downtown overlay district, and the other is it's the Lidditz Run revitalization overlay, because there's an industrial area they're trying to get to revitalize, because a lot of those industrial uses have closed down. I would say it's pretty fair that on-street parking is very abundant in this community. And one of the things they do differently is if you have parking in front of your building, you can count that parking based on their standards of parallel spaces towards your required off-street parking. So it provides some relief to the business where they don't have to put everything off-street. They can count some of that on-street parking for their business, understanding that it's not going to be in use all of the time. It's going to be in use whenever the business is open. So I did end up talking to the community planner in Lidditz as well. And he said they permit some off-site and some shared parking, but I really wanted to find out, they have a very reduced parking requirement in their overlay district. And I wondered if that was, intended to try to support existing uses. And he said, actually, they had a lot of underutilized spaces in their downtown, and they were trying to get better utilization. So they provided some relief for certain types of uses that they wanted to attract there. What he told me, and interestingly enough, this gentleman grew up in Reedsville, and he's very familiar with Boalsburg. And so when we were talking about this, he said, first off, he pointed out that Lidditz is a lot different than Boalsburg, as did Doylestown. They both felt the need to tell me that they're a lot more dense and a lot bigger, and we know that. But one of the things he said was that in their community in particular, parking is more of a perception. The parking problems are more of a perception in terms of availability. They have so much parking on their side streets, but when folks come in to go to a business and they don't find a space really close to the front of that business, they just drive away and they go somewhere else. And he said they actually did a parking study where they overlaid the local mall over downtown and showed that when you're at the mall, you're walking a couple hundred feet to go from store to store, but people don't want to have to park more than 50 feet from the front door of the business they're going to. So they definitely have a lot of parking on the street in Lidditz, which Boalsburg does not have. So here's a picture of Main Street in Lidditz. And you can again see the kind of character of the community as well as a lot of that on-street parking. They have parking. This is one of those communities that has very deep lots and they're wider. So they have parking behind them. This is a parking lot behind their commercial area. And then they also have a lot of parking on these side streets. This is just one of the residential streets that intersect with Main Street. And you can see they have a fair amount of parking there that people could locate their vehicle and then walk back downtown to go shopping. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are the townships that we looked at. We looked at 4 townships in total. All of these had villages that were, I think, a lot more comparable in size to Boalsburg and comparable in terms of the types of uses that are located there. Generally, they all had lower density development than the boroughs that we looked at. They had some on-street parking, but otherwise they had very limited parking facilities. The street parking was often limited just to their main street or main streets. They may have, more than one, but at most 2 streets through the community might have some parking located along it. And pedestrian facilities are less extensive. There were some that had a pretty good parking network to get you along their main street, but not much beyond that. So you were pretty much, if you're parking along Main Street, you could walk somewhere, but you didn't have much other options to park elsewhere and walk in. So the first township I wanted to talk about, the first village, is Bowmansville in Brecknock Township, Lancaster County. This is located between Lancaster and Reading near the Pennsylvania Turnpike. There's actually a Bowmansville rest area along the turnpike. So if you've seen that, you're pretty close to this community. It's a small village. It's primarily residential. They have a handful of non-residential uses. They have a post office, a couple restaurants. I think they have a hardware store and an antique store. It's zoned neighborhood commercial, which again is kind of similar to what we have in Harris Township, where it's focused more on the residential with some non-residential uses. Now in Bowmansville, they restrict non-residential uses more so than Harris Township does. They only allow non-residential uses by special exception, where you have to go before the zoning hearing board, except retail shops. Those are permitted by right. That's the one use that you do not need to go to the zoning hearing board to get permitted. And Bowmansville has no on-street parking whatsoever. And here's a street view of PA 625 that goes through Bowmansville, and you can see there's shoulders, but they're really only wide enough for bicyclists to use. And here's another one of Reading Road, just kind of giving you the character of the area. The next community, the next village we looked at was Maytown in East Donegal Township, Lancaster County. This is located west of Lancaster near Marietta and Columbia. It's a small village, again, primarily residential with just a handful of non-residential uses. What was unique about Maytown, and it reminded me a lot of Boalsburg looking at it from an aerial, is that it has a town square, very similar to the Diamond. It also has very deep lots that are accessed by very narrow rear alleyways. So a lot of the same kind of layout that you find in Boalsburg, where there's not a lot of accessibility to parking in the rear because of these alleyways. And folks might park out in front of their building just because they don't want to have to park so far away from their house. Zoned urban extension residential, again, very similar to our village district in terms of the types of uses it allows. One thing that was unique about Maytown is they actually restrict non-residential uses. So any type of a commercial office use is limited to historic structures only. So they have not allowed anyone to come in and tear down a building and put up a new office or a new restaurant. You need to use a historic structure. And I think they go as far as to define which buildings are historic and which ones are not, because they have a historic overlay. And basically, that's been their way of restricting non-residential uses from coming in and I think taking up a lot of the on-street parking that is available in Maytown. Their on-street parking is only available along their main streets. There's two main roadways that go through Maytown that have on-street parking. So here is a view of South River Street in Maytown. And here is one of Maytown's square, where you can see it kind of like the Diamond. It has some parking available to the public there around this roundabout. And here's a picture of one of their alleyways. It's less trees than you'd find in Boalsburg, but you can see they have some parking areas in the rear of these lots that are accessed by these very narrow alleys. So the last one of these villages I was going to cover real fast is St. Peter's Village in Warwick Township, Chester County. This is located about 30 miles southeast of Reading. As you can see, it's a very charming little village. It's got a lot of neat structures there right along the road. It's a historic village with a mixture of uses, a lot of residential and non-residential combined. It's zoned neighborhood business with a historic heritage overlay. On-street, much like Lidditz, on-street parking can apply to the requirements for the business or for the use. So if you have parking along the street, you can count that towards your off-street parking requirements. However, looking at this, there's obviously not a lot of parking along the street. It's not a very common thing in St. Peter's Village. And they do have some off-street surface lots. As I was doing more research to figure out who owned those lots, I found out that this entire village is actually owned by a condominium association. So the entire village was put into a condominium a couple decades ago in a private effort to preserve the character. Each of the buildings is a condominium, and this condominium association owns and operates these parking lots to provide places for visitors to park and visit. And they also regulate uses beyond what the municipality regulates through their zoning. And here's a picture, street view of St. Peter's, just another view of the main street. And here's a picture, view of their parking areas that they have, at least one of their parking lots. So I think, that the memo went into more detail about some of the different ways that each of these communities or different strategies communities use to regulate their parking. I think the key takeaways from my perspective as a planner is that there really is no one size fits all solution for parking. And every potential solution could probably create new ones. And it's important to think about, well, if this is done, what will this mean moving forward for other uses or other things that might come up? And generally, the parking regulations that we found in all these communities reflected what the community's character was, the type of goals they had for their community in terms of growth and development, and then also what infrastructure is available. I know the memo talked, I addressed in there how on-street parking, it would be difficult to provide more on-street parking in Boalsburg. There's just not the right-of-way widths there to put parking along the roads without having to take people's front lawns or their homes, which I think would probably go against some of the other community goals that Harris Township has. So it's really important to think about what is available in terms of what can be done. So I think from our perspective, looking at this, what could be further examined? I think permitting some on-street parking, like Lidditz and St. Peter's Village do, to count towards off-street parking requirements could be considered. Development of off-street public parking, which has been discussed by this committee and by the board as well. Some improvements to sidewalks to allow people to get from parking off-site to the downtown part of the village. Increase that off-site parking distance. Right now, as we all know, it's only 66 feet that you can have parking located away from your property. A lot of these communities are several hundred feet that you're allowed to go with your parking. That would be something to consider. Perhaps some shared parking standards. I think they would be worth considering. Permitting parking reductions with sufficient documentation, like Kennett Square and a couple other communities do. Special regulations, perhaps, for some of the properties that we know have no ability to provide for off-street parking, in particular down near the Diamond. And then also, I think, we could also look at some other communities to see if there's other ways and strategies that other places have used. And maybe it would be something to also consider amendments beyond the parking ordinance that might affect how parking can be provided and located. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'll stop sharing my screen. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee might have about what research we were able to do.
Doylestown, the parking garage that is the distance away, the big parking garage. You mentioned that the smaller parking garage of 100 and some cars can only be used after 5 o'clock when the employees leave. The bigger parking garage is quite a distance. I mean, it's a few blocks away. It's certainly more than 66 feet. It's certainly more than a couple hundred feet. It's certainly more than, I would walk that far without any issue at all. Most people, it's always, you go to the lowest common denominator all the time, but I would have no problems walking that far. But is that particular parking lot used as a shared parking area? Because if that is, then that gives us a different standard than what we've been looking at for quite a while now.
My understanding of talking to both Doylestown Borough and the Bucks County Parking Office is that parking that's in that garage was what they had to provide for the Justice Center they built. I don't think they can lease those spaces out because they are called for the Justice Center, but they've allowed it to be open to the public where they don't restrict who can park there throughout the day. I don't know if that, I don't think it's used officially by any businesses. People might use it though and walk downtown, much like you said, I would do the same.
I guess I'm not talking about the leases. I'm talking more about we have a concept parking. We need to have a shared parking. That doesn't mean we have to have leases. It doesn't mean we have to have this. It doesn't mean we have to have that. We do have to know where the shared parking is. So is there, in fact, are they considering this on the back end that says, but we have this over here. So even though the leases may overlap and nobody knows what the leases are, or whatever, they still have that big parking garage that still leaves them in compliance. Now, are they using that to be in compliance? And if they are, that's a whole new standard of where we can go.
I don't think they're using that parking garage to be in compliance for new uses that are coming into Doylestown that need to have more parking. It's my understanding just that garage exists for the public to use. Now, maybe then you justify reducing the amount of parking that they require for certain uses in Doylestown because they have all of these public spaces available. That is perhaps justification for not requiring so much for a new use. But like you mentioned, not wanting to have, the leases and the shared parking, if someone is required to have that parking and the community or the borough is requiring to demonstrate that they've entered into it to show they actually have it. And they did not say that parking garage was being used in that way. It was just kind of an overflow option for folks to utilize.
Okay, I see the hand up from Robin. Robin, do you have some comments?
No, it's just me futzing, Bob. I was going to say to Mark, I thought what you did in the research was very comprehensive, so thank you.
Thank you.
I think some of the thing is, let's go to some other people here to hear your comments. Yes, Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to know more information about Lidditz, where they did the on-street parking in front of business. How did they, put that in place with how, anybody can park there, or, how many spots did they get? How did they work that out? And is it just new business get it, or previous businesses, they also have that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You mentioned how does it work? It sounds to me like, they require 22 feet of distance for every parallel space. So whatever frontage you have of your property, you can count that towards your required off-street parking. It doesn't mean that it's set aside for just visitors to use, because anyone can use it. It's not, your parking, but it's a way of recognizing that there's a place for people to park to use your property. I think the challenge comes in that we have a lot of businesses in the village that already rely on some of that off-street parking for their customers. So certainly if everyone can count what's in front of their property, it could mean that you're taking parking away from somebody else that's relying on it today. But it seems to be something that has worked okay and in St. Peter's Village to some minimal degree.
It's interesting, having worked in Bollesburg for quite a long time. You did mention the idea that residential is one of the primary functions of the downtown area. And I think it's also one of the issues because the people that live in these houses park along the street, some of them all day long. They rent their building to people. Those people are there all day long. So that really starts to take away from the available parking for commercial. And that's a very common observation. So
I would agree.
you might be able to use it to count as your requirement, but quite frankly, it could be used by not just other people, but could be used by residential people that really leave their car there all week and don't even use it. And I've seen that, believe me.
You're right.
No, that was going to be,
Okay, I didn't mean to grab the conversation, but let's see, anyone else want to talk a little?
Bob, this is Cheryl.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that's my question. It again goes back to what is the real issue and how many spaces are used by residents that have parking somewhere else behind their house, behind their apartment or wherever, but they're using the street parking. And if we could regulate that, or should we regulate that, if we really have a parking problem?
I think that's a statement of fact that we ought to record. That's a good question.
Yeah.
I do.
I've witnessed that.
It's not just the residences, it's the buildings downtown, and they were right next to me and right up the street that rent out apartments. And those cars sometimes stay there all week long without being used.
Right.
So I think you raise a very good point. I think it's something we can put into our kind of wish list of what we're going to try to recommend. It's a good point, Cheryl. Anyone else?
Bob,
Yes, Jackie.
should there be a certain amount required? And maybe there is. If you have a boarding house, for example, that rents out 8 rooms, shouldn't they have a higher requirement than a family?
Yeah, and they would we have different standards for different uses, and generally the more intensive the use, the more parking that's required.
Okay.
The problem is that unless they change a use or add a new use, the parking doesn't get interjected into the equation. In other words, if you've had an apartment for the last 10 years and you've rented it out and you haven't done any renovations that require change of use or code, these calculations just don't get brought up to date. It's only when you do something.
I think almost everything we're suggesting is going to take some kind of policing. And that's still, we get back to basics. I mean, you can tell people you're not allowed to park overnight, or if you're a resident, park in your own yard, but who's going to
Yeah.
enforce that?
How do we feel about this? I'm listening to something that perhaps has some merit. I'm not sure about policing, but I'm concerned about, let's say, rooming houses, where there is a 2 or 3 people in a building that park out front, and the owner of the property doesn't provide parking in the rear when they could. I don't know how we deal with that. Is that something we ought to put on our punch list as something to look into?
Yeah.
Providing rear parking?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I know I could feel for the residents that live along the street that want to park out front, take their groceries in, not have to bring them up the back. But we had an incident at a basketful last year when there was some construction going on. There was a construction trailer parked there for several
Right.
days, and it was impeding our FedEx and UPS deliveries because they couldn't even get near to get some of the bigger boxes unloaded. So we finally tracked down the person and just asked them if they can move their vehicle, which they gladly did. But I think it was that, didn't even think about it, that it might. So, is it creating awareness in the community? I have no answers to that question. It's just an observation of something that we witnessed at the store.
Well, I think that sometimes when you get building permits, whether it be a zoning permit or a building permit, there could be some language in there that indicates that if you're a construction firm and you plan to park on the street, there ought to be some regulations imposed that, when you work at Penn State, you park out at the Bryce Jordan Center and you bring all your people in. You don't park right next to the building. So there might be regulations that we can entertain that, I don't know. Todd would know better, and so
Todd
would
Todd
Randy.
has his hand up.
Oh, hi. Todd.
Hi, Bob. I wanted to point out that it's something that was just discussed is actually the opposite of the way the regulations are written. The parking regulations for residential structures, if you have 4 or fewer dwelling units in a structure, you're required to have 2 off-street parking spaces per dwelling unit. When you get to more than 4 dwelling units in a structure, that's reduced to 1.5. So the more units you have in a residential building, actually the less parking you're required to provide per dwelling unit.
Wow. Well, let's take note of that. It sounds like an inverse curve that isn't correct. I mean, just Newton's law tells you the more people you have, the more parking you need.
But Todd, we don't allow anything above a 2-family dwelling in the village, correct? The most you can have is 2 units?
Yeah, I think we allow single family detached and we allow duplex.
So some of this has to go back and look at our existing zoning just to make recommendations that are spot on with perhaps changes if we wish to have changes, but we have to know where we're starting from. Okay.
A comment earlier that there was she said that the people people do have parking behind their houses, and then Robin mentioned that, of course, it's nice to take your groceries in the front of your house or whatever. But I guess I also know that there are people who have eliminated or made it so they couldn't have parking behind their houses for one reason or another. So that leaves them necessarily have to park on the street. I mean, I don't know how I feel about all this because I certainly want everybody to have what they wish. And I do, which makes it hard. But yeah, of course, the people I'm talking about don't complain either. So, but I wonder where that falls into our discussion as well. Because I'm not quite sure. I mean, are we requiring people to have parking in the back of their house, a residential house? Or are we saying, okay, well, if you eliminate it because you've got so much crap back there, is that okay? You see what
Well,
I'm saying?
I think the short answer to the question is if you had parking that was legal parking and you met the standard for the parking that's in the zoning ordinance, and then for some reason you removed it, and you no longer have the amount of spaces you're required to have when you once did, you're violating the ordinance, you're violating the law, and the township could make you restore that parking.
I think also to Tracy's comment, when you look at plans that are being presented to you, you do the calculations for parking, you do the based on the present or what we'll be talking about, maybe future numbers. And you then indicate that if they have space in the back, that they have space in the back, comma, then that has to be used for parking in some way. And it's up to the owner to present the scheme, how they're going to meet the parking requirements. Now, if they build a fence behind it and doesn't allow access, that probably wouldn't get through the zoning permit or the approval. Cheryl.
Yeah, I've had a couple people say to me, they have a garage and they use it, and now they've gone to maybe a 2 or 3 car, and they'd like to expand the garage, and they have the space to expand it on their property, but the zoning won't allow them to do that. And so then you have that issue because then those people are parking one of their cars on the street. So
Right.
is that something that can be adjusted? Is that true? Or,
No,
Yeah, there may be cases where properties are small enough or narrow enough, or they have so much coverage with structures and or impervious surfaces that they can't locate any other structures on the property, or they can't expand the structures that they have. Honestly, those situations are very rare when they're proposed to the township. There haven't been more than a couple in the whole time I've worked here that we've had to say that you can't do that because you don't physically have the area to do that.
okay. So if somebody wanted to do that and they have the space, they might be granted that opportunity.
Yeah, and actually, the way, we're probably going to get to talking about it sooner or later. A lot of people think that if they can't build the garage or they can't build the structure that they want to build where they want to build it, it's as simple as going to the zoning hearing board and saying, here's my hardship. I can't build the garage where I want to build it, even though I have room on the property to do it elsewhere. Grant me a variance so I can do what I want. And the zoning hearing board is by definition supposed to say no. If you have a way on your property to build a structure so that it's in compliance with the regulations, the zoning hearing board is not supposed to grant a variance of those regulations in order for you to do it. So when we eventually get to that conversation, that's not what the zoning hearing board is there for. They're there to hear instances where properties have some unique circumstance that prevents them from complying with the ordinance in any reasonable way.
On that note, I have a question. Now that you brought it up, I do have a question. Specifically, I just because it's an example, specifically about Bud's property. You go in the alley, and on one side, of course, you have, you're allowed to build up the structures right on the side of the alley. On the other side of Academy Street, you're right on the alley there. And you go to Bud's house, and he has, what is it, 30-foot setback, is it? I think. And he's like, I don't understand. He doesn't complain about it, trust me, but I don't understand either why there'd be a 30-foot setback there and just a block away, there isn't. And I just don't understand, I mean, what it is.
Yeah, I think the difference is, if you're talking about Bud's house property that fronts on Pine Street, that property is in the R1 zoning district, it's single family residential. From the alley behind his house to the alley behind the township building, that's the village zoning district, and the village has different setbacks. The rear setback in the R1 zoning district is 30 feet. The rear setback in the village zoning district is 6. That's true anywhere that two zoning districts abut each other. The setbacks are probably going to be different, even if they're on the opposite sides of streets, or even if the properties are side by side and the zoning district line goes down the common property line. A side setback for one property could be one thing, and the neighbor has a different side setback.
Are these setbacks set by the township, or these setbacks, who makes these rules?
The Board of Supervisors, at some point in Harris Township's history, the Board of Supervisors established what the setbacks are in all the zoning districts. If you looked at the zoning ordinances for all the other center region municipalities and you compared comparable zoning districts in each of those municipalities, you would find that the setbacks in all those comparable zoning districts are pretty much the same. There's very little.
Right. I think some of the, having been in Ballsburg quite a number of years, that back in the 70s and the 80s, early 80s, there was a recognition that we had some pretty interesting facilities were non-conforming, close to the setback or on the setback, and so I think that the supervisors at that time, and I could be wrong, Todd, but I think they were trying to be sympathetic when they set up the village district requirements to allow some of these buildings, like, and you know where they are, and we can identify them. They're right close to the property line. And so they would be non-conforming in a major way, and we wanted to keep them. So that might have been some of the energy behind the village district setbacks being not like the normal setbacks from residential or commercial. I think it had a little historic context to it.
Bob, Frank has his hand up.
Yes, Frank, I'm sorry. I didn't see that. Where is it?
I'm here. It's that little yellow
Okay.
thing up in the corner.
I'm sorry.
No, I think this discussion needs to go on. I like it. But one of the things I think I asked maybe a long time ago, do we know two things? Number one, do we know how many parking spaces we require in the village? Number two, do we know how many we actually have today, whether it's on street, off street? Because if we don't know those two numbers, we're going to know if we have enough parking or too much. I guess that's just a question. And I hate to say that because I know Todd and Mark, but they don't have anything else to do. But I know Todd and Mark might have to get involved in that. But that's just a question I have.
Frank, to answer your question about the inventory, we did look and we had some maps, the first couple of meetings showing which properties are in compliance and which ones are not in terms of the parking. I have numbers from those that we could look at. We've never counted the number of on-street spaces. That would be something we'd have to do to try to quantify
Yeah, I
that.
think Frank brings up a very good point. We need to know where we are right now. So if we can get that number, and I think these maps that you produced are absolutely need to be in front of us more when we have the opportunity to meet. But they're great maps. They show exactly the dynamics of the downtown area, what's conforming, what's not, how small they are. There's a lot of visual information there. So good point, Frank. It's excellent. We need to know where we're starting from. Excellent. So that should be a to-do list for, I guess, Mark. Thank you. Anyone else? Let's keep this going a little bit. Yes, Jackie.
You know, Tracy's mentioned, and I agree with her, that people are going to go to the spot of least resistance. They want to be close to where they're going. Instead of trying to find a major parking lot, is there the potential to do several small ones? That way, more areas. I mean, like right by the Diamond, there's land we own, the township owns. We couldn't make a big parking lot there, but we could fit a few cars in. You know, several other places we might be able to do that instead of trying to invent land that doesn't exist.
I think your
At the
point,
same time-
we have, yeah. I think
I'm
that's a good
saying
point.
that You're concerned, Tracy, about walking. I think Bellefonte in the parking lot. And actually, the parking that we're going to have at the township building is going to be more convenient to get anywhere in Bollesburg than the Bellefonte parking lot is to get back up to the main street.
Well, we moved our office to Bellefonte, and I can guarantee you it's a problem. Parking is an issue. Period. They don't have, but I don't want to get into that. I think you're bringing up a good point. I think if we had these maps and did a kind of a group meeting, you know, Amy's talking about maybe at the fire hall,
Yep.
where we put these maps up on the wall and we all can stand up and put stickies on various areas that we think have potential, then at least we've done our due diligence to look at some of them and offer opinion as to is there enough parking? You know, when you start dealing with parking lot, you have to deal with circulation and some regulations about roadways and everything. But we could look at the whole thing and say, okay, at Bollesburg, we have potentially X. At the churches, X. Here's a site we could maybe get 4 or 5. And so I think we could have a good discussion about that. Everyone could get involved. And then we could evaluate, do we want to take the Diamond and take out all the grass and put a parking lot in there? I mean,
No.
there's got to be some value going on.
No, we can't do that.
No, I know that. I know that. But I've just been being a bad guy. But I think your point's well taken, and I think that event's going to happen. I think it'd be well worth looking specifically at the downtown area and what spaces we have available. There aren't a lot of them.
No, but we don't need a lot of them if we had several that would hold.
Yeah, and the other question that I was interested in was, and this would come from the business people, you know, Robin and some of the other business people, Tracy, is that having been in Bollesburg and watching the rhythm of it day by day, there aren't a lot of people that come to town. And that's not a good thing. I wish it were more for the liveliness of the businesses. But it's not like at the moment, at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, there aren't a lot of people. We do have a lot of activity at Amy or Tracy's place, where in the past we used to have buses come in for lunch and people would be walking around. And that was kind of nice. They would walk up the street, you know, 250 yards and then turn around and come back and look at the gutters going over the sidewalks. And you know, that'll come back someday. So I think we have to be positive. But
Could I just ask a quick question?
yes, of course.
I know that in terms of who would pay for the initial creation of these, you know, nice little parking lots, the question number one is who would pay for them? Number two, our regulations do require that they're screened with shrubs and that type of stuff. I think that's one thing we need to look at. I like the idea. I'm the one who put the idea of Reedsville forward because they do have small lots, but we also have to look at the real cost involved with it and who would pay for it.
So Diane, I can maybe expound upon that just a little bit. I was at a statewide meeting last week and we're getting $632,000 in federal funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. We got half of it last year. We get the second half of it this year. One of the things that I believe we might be able to do helping our business community is we could probably use some of that funds if the supervisors wanted to to put toward some parking lots within the village and also maybe some sidewalk improvements. There are other communities in the state that are actually doing the same thing, and they've loosened up some of the regulations. So there might be, we've got a big culvert we've got to replace, but we're getting some money back from that. So there might be an opportunity to look into using some of that funding to help address some of the parking situation, with putting some lots and helping our business community.
And
That's a good source.
yes, Jackie, did you have something?
No,
Okay.
I just moved.
Oh, okay.
I have a question about that. When we do the township parking lot, okay?
Mhm.
Are we actually, is that parking lot going to be, are we utilizing that parking lot, or are we gonna best utilize that parking lot to have the largest number of spaces we can possibly get in there? We have to make it look nice, but are we gonna have to like put all these islands in it and put this in it and put that limit in it that'll like take away 6 spaces?
No, we reasonably think that, and we're gonna, hopefully, we found someone who will take the pole shed down, and that he wants to do it this winter. So I've talked to the supervisors Monday night about that. But once the pole shed comes down, we're gonna have a plan done. We're gonna have a survey done by the College Township Engineering Department and then do a plan. We think we probably can get 13 spaces behind the township building. So that's not a ton.
Why can't we get more than 13?
Because of the requirements with how big a space has to be, but we'll do a plan to see how many we can get back there. So it's not going to be a ton. We have to look at if we can remove, we have a storage tank for fuel back there. If we want to remove that and remove that concrete structure, we still want to keep our garage there because we do store items that we need when we're downtown, so that we can get in and out there. But we have to look at how we're going to configure things, and that'll be part of the plan. I'm hoping, knocking on wood, that maybe the supervisors could look at that in March, just to get a rudimentary idea of what they could do there.
But could I just also remind people that there are residents that are right around that parking lot?
Well, of
So
course,
we
we
need
know
to take
that.
them into consideration also.
If you notice my comment, I also said that what can we do to make that nicer around the edges?
Well,
It's a lot
luckily
of
I
we
this-
definitely
do.
think that that's true. I
Yeah.
definitely think that we need to do something like that. to-
Right, and luckily
to
we
make it
do
better.
have, in one of the, I guess, what was it, 4 years ago, one of the plans, it does call for screening around it. So that goes along with your idea, Tracy.
I think a
The
lot
idea
of
is what
these
kind of
things-
screening is the best kind?
As a designer, I can assure you that if I did a plan for that parking lot, it would have the proper screening, it would have the proper acknowledgements of the neighbors and so forth, just an interaction with the township. So those things will happen. It's not that like the township's going to go in there and ignore some of their regulations that they impose on other people. I tend to think of creative landscaping, not just putting a tree every 4 feet on center and saying we solved it, but that's up to the township. We got some good people in the township that look at the plans and planning commission and so forth. So let's let them do their job. They're sensitive to the neighbors. I know they are. Sorry about that Russian comment, but I deal with it every day in the design world. And I think we all, with lighting and everything else that it can be imposing on your neighbors, I'm sure there'll be some real good discussion about what type of lighting and the illumination on other people's properties and all of that. So,
Well, and Bob, I just want to add one thing to kind of to Tracy's point where, maybe we only get 13 spaces there, but I think if we do this inventory, which I have on your takeaway
Right.
list, if we do this inventory and we actually identify how many spaces we need, and then we look for other opportunities, maybe you don't get 25 spaces at the township building, but maybe you get 13 there and you find another place where you can get 5 and another place. And I love the idea of Lidditz in basically putting the footprint of the Park City Mall on top of their downtown to show that you actually have parking and people just need to kind of walk. And
exactly.
It's a perception thing. People will park as far away from the Target or the Walmart or whatever as they can. But if they come to Boalsburg, they better be parked right outside of the front door of Duffy's, or else they're going to have a problem. So again, that's a perception thing that we'll have to to work on.
I think too, we have to understand that one place, I think I think it was brought up earlier by Mark, that one place isn't going to solve the whole issue. We're lucky. We're absolutely lucky that we have an opportunity to put those 13 in, or whatever number that'll end up being. I think that's very fortunate. But that may not be, as in the end, maybe 5 years from now, we'll find that because of more success in the downtown retail and everything, we're going to have to find 10 more. And then if we start some discussion with these other parties right now, when that moment comes up, it won't be such a hard introduction. We could go right into it.
Does every parking lot require lighting or only after a certain number?
I think life safety comes into play. I would talk to Todd a little bit, and also maybe Mark. But typically, we have to provide some security lighting in the parking lots that we do at university. Now, that's a whole different environment. I know downtown State College, because of the number of students and the people traveling from fraternities and so forth, they've really pumped up their lighting for safety. I think you just don't get out of your car and fall. Then you're in a liable situation. So we would have to provide something.
Yeah, I think we have some existing lighting in our back parking lot now, and if we were to line up some spaces along the west property line of the property, my guess would be the best way to do lighting would be the short bollard lights that only have the lens for the fixtures pointing toward the township building, not pointing out.
Yeah, and I also noticed that one slide that Mark showed, a really nice map of where parking is. I thought that was so great. I mean, once people get out of this, come to Boalsburg, they have some idea of where these are even before they get there. So signage will be critical. Connectivity, if it's a fire company who, by the way, may only have to put some meters in there or some signs, and that's the cost benefit, and permission to do that, you would want to look at the connectivity of that lot to the diamond. Is it safe? Do we have to do some sidewalk improvements, some ADA curbing, that type of thing, which I see is being done already. So, but there's a cost benefit there that's maybe a little bit less than what would happen at the township right now. And maybe even there at the churches, it would be possible to construct parking without a lot of expenditure. Okay, let's go. Let's keep going. It's about 8 o'clock, and at 8:15, we're gonna talk. Well, that's what we're doing right now. We're talking about some of the takeaways from Mark's presentation. Why don't we talk about some of the things that we heard? What are some of the restrictions that we heard? Narrow streets. It's a problem. I know at one point there was an effort to narrow the streets to cut down speeding. So, State College has done that quite a bit to create pathways that reduce speeding. What are some of the other issues that we're going to, narrow streets is definitely a big one, but it adds to the charm of the village. Any thoughts? Well, Amy, you're going to rely a lot in your minutes.
We can do that.
I will say something here, not so much about restrictions, but I think, like, I was looking back over Mark's presentation and some of those areas, and I think this is probably what sort of one of the things that started this whole parking thing was the ability for some, and this is from a business perspective, new businesses to come into our community so that we do go back to the sort of days of where there was more people in the community. So what could we do if somebody came in and wanted to develop a new business or bring a new business in, how do we help them get to where they want to be and be able to bring some more vitalization to the community that we really need? I think, and I don't think anybody says, oh, we don't need that. I think they agree. So I think it's imperative that we come up with some, not just what's existing, but think a little bit further out, because there are places that could potentially bring in some new business, new life to the downtown community, but not
Right.
overextending that we ruin the whole aesthetics of the residential community, commercial type thing. So I think it's really imperative on this committee to put some ideas forward that will help not just people that are here now, but people that want to be part of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely, I think, the goal. There's a lot of rumor stuff going on, and we need to really have a clear path. And people, I think it's a responsibility to real estate people, when they start bringing people in, they need to, as we learned in our first or second meeting, it's not more complicated in parking and some of the requirements. It's just not easy, and people don't realize it, and they need to be instructed so that the community encourages them, but at the same time, there are these regulations that have to be met. So,
right, because I think that's what Littis did, is maybe not loosened, but modified some of their regulations so that encourages some of that development or bring in. So it's not saying, oh, we completely change the rules for you, but we recognize that there has to be some modifications on these types of things.
yeah, I was curious of some of the reduced parking requirements and what some of those were in so that we can look at those, and some of the parking restrictions, so that I think maybe Mark covered them, but it would be nice to know a little bit more on how they help businesses to be able to meet the requirement, but still be responsible and for what they have to do. So
No question.
I think that's a good point, Robin. We got to always be positive and try to encourage.
Can I ask a question in reference to that? You ready? Am I muted?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I guess so somebody in the village, okay, opens a coffee shop, just say. Okay, because that you need probably a little more parking with a coffee shop. But say you need 4 parking spaces for the coffee shop. But you say, oh, okay, I'm in the middle of, I don't know, one street, another street, the distance. So you have an alley behind you, and you can create those 4 parking spots needed behind your building. Bam. But nobody wants to use those 4 parking spots. And there's all this complicated stuff. Like, for example, Pam next door, she has parking out back. I mean, she has 4 parking spots out back, no problems, no issues. But none of her customers will ever park out back.
No, because it's a.
Well, I think you're right.
So you're coming in, you're so convoluted. All of it is so convoluted. She doesn't need shared parking, but it's just very interesting. All these convoluted issues that come into play. It's just like, so I guess I don't understand sometimes. It's like when we put things together and we talk about these things, we talk about the number of parking spots we have versus what we need. Do we include the 4 in Pam's back because she has those and she needs none? What do we do? Do we potentially turn around and say, well, how many are we really going to need given the possibilities that are out there? And you see what I'm saying? It really gets
Right. Because if somebody.
I'm going to say one thing, Tracy. There are people that work in these businesses, and the people that work in the businesses, and I, for one, had a number of people.
Yes, I agree.
Is that we tried very hard, even though it was not necessarily legal, to put everyone in the back of the property so they
Yes.
weren't parking on the street. And
Yes.
that was their commitment. And some of them complained in the winter. And I said, well, that's the way it is. They work at Hoffman Leakey. You get your feet wet once in a while. So I think that although those aren't your customers, your people would be taking up parking if we didn't do that. So I know that's not the answer you want to hear, but we got to put parking for the people that work in the community. Yes, there's someone else I heard.
Frank has his hand up.
Is it Frank? Okay, Frank, sir.
Yeah, that little yellow thing up in the corners means my hand's up.
Oh. Well, that's very nice,
Oh, well,
Frank. I see that. I appreciate your imagery.
And a couple comments, and one of them, in answer to Tracy, there's an old saying that goes around that around the world that says, "That's a theory, but how's it really work?" You know, if you know, you can sit there and say, "I don't want everybody to come into my kitchen on the right-hand door and leave on the left-hand door," but half the people are going to do what they want anyway. So we can only provide the parking. We can't go out there and make them pull into certain spots. From that standpoint, I know your frustration, but there's not a whole lot we can do other than create and make sure that we have parking. With that being said, my comment is this: as we talk about, loosening some of the requirements or changing them for new businesses to attract new businesses or relaxing some requirements, I think one of the things I would like to see this committee come out with are exact situations, because what's going to happen if you don't, people are going to come before us and say, we want to do this, and we may not like that and vote no against that one and yes against the one tomorrow. Well, I'll guarantee you that's not going to go over big anytime, because no matter which way, we'd be wrong half the time. So I would really encourage us to have, exact, maybe a formula or we're trying to attract a certain type of business and we're going to relax them for that type of business. But I'd like to have as many specifics in it as we can, because if we don't, Mark, Todd, you guys know what'll happen when it comes to the meetings. It's going to be, we're going to always be the bad guy. So that's just a comment.
I think that we ought to work on that. That's a little tough to try to do, but I think it may be our responsibility to at least try it, to get that formula, as you say, a little more scientific approach. So, well, it's about 8:15, and I'm told by Amy that I can have my milk and cookies and go to bed at 8:30. So let's talk a little bit about what we want to do for the next meeting, and maybe a follow-up on where we're headed to put closure on this discussion that we've had now for a number of meetings. So Amy, or other people, there was an agenda item put out for the next meeting, talking to the churches, representatives, the fire company, putting the maps on the wall, having sticker, where are we going to put parking, try to get specific.
Yeah, I thought at the next meeting, we could have the representatives from the fire company, the churches, and also, and I know Patricia's on the call today, invite there are, I think, 4 or 5 property owners that they don't have any off-street parking. They're all clustered around the diamond, but also have them come, because I think they're an important part of the conversation. Because if we're going to talk about, oh, you could use the fire hall, maybe that doesn't really work for them, or maybe reduction in parking does work. Like I use the dog groomer all the time as my example. The dog groomer doesn't have any walk-in business. You meet them in the parking lot, you drop the dog off, the dog goes in and gets groomed, you come back, you pick them up. So they're maybe a good example of how a reduction in parking could be allowed, because the nature of the business is so unique. So I think inviting these property owners in to the meeting next month would be helpful, so we can talk with them and hear some of their challenges.
Can we do it at, maybe, would you do it at the township building, or would you do it?
I was going to see, since we're going to talk to the fire hall, if we could use the fire hall, since we'll be right there, we can all go out in the parking lot and look at it.
Well, yeah, and then there's a lot of parking there, believe me. And the way they're parking there during fire events is a little bit different than it was when I was involved. So there's more available parking. I think another one might be interesting is to try to take a stab at the numbers that Frank was talking about, in terms of this is what we have right now. If we were to kind of lay out, stripe the street with actual legal parking stalls, this is what we would end up with, noting fire hydrants and so forth. So that number might be nice. Mark, bring your maps, because they're fantastic. And we can use those, as I say, we could put stickies on them and say, what about looking at this site or this site, and pluses and minuses. It could be a good work session.
One quick question is, do the maps, Mark, show what part of that large space belongs to the Lutheran church and what part belongs to the fire hall? Or is it all the fire hall? I don't know that.
I don't think the maps I created previously showed that part of the townships. We were looking just at the village. But I can provide some maps maybe of the surrounding area where
Yeah,
these
I
places
have a
are
pretty
and
good,
the owners.
Okay, thanks.
I did a site plan when we did the new addition to the fire. So I know pretty much where the property lines are. To answer your question, it runs down, the fire company does not own that property that the churches have. They use it for accessibility and exiting, but they don't own it. There used to be an alley there and it was consumed in, it was taken up or something. So, something
Well,
happened.
Can we
Yeah,
maybe be able to think of some hypothetical situations that may come up in the future, just to give us an idea of where our minds should be going when we think about what unique situations we may have coming up? I mean, I think about some things and it just, like, I mean, for example, if Duffy's Tavern, I sold Duffy's Tavern and the person who bought it decided to make it into a retail business. And they had little things, little rooms and everything. And then all of a sudden, the next person who bought it wanted to take it back to its original function, its best function, which is a tavern. The change of use of that would say, I need 60 spaces. So that's like a litmus test to me. What on earth would happen? And maybe like it's a very hypothetical situation, but it's one that keeps my I'm proprietary, of course, but I'm just one that keeps my mind picked a little bit because these situations will come up, in the
I think they
future.
will. I think they could. And that's why I think it's not my night here to just give the township staff all this glory, but I think that we have a great staff and we have great procedures and we have a good planning commission and we have people that would probably look into that and say, for the mission that we're trying to accomplish downtown, maybe we ought to look at this case and see how we can satisfy the situation without setting priority that would make someone else not have to follow the same procedures. So I
We
think
have a
so.
good staff and we have this, but this is the reason why we're here is because something very negative happened in our community.
Well, we're here to try to fix it, and that's why we're here. So
Exactly.
give it a
And-
chance. Got to
and
give it a
have-
chance, Tracy.
Oh, but I'd like to see
Bob.
some creative thinking about what might happen, so we can maybe think of how we solve things. Also, that may not be relevant to us right now, we might not be thinking about right now. Give a path to the supervisors, give a path and say, we should be creative here, we should be creative there. We don't have to nail things into law. It's something that definitely should be looked at as things come up. And that's what, I just would like to leave open-ended a little bit to make sure that we are not harsh or having a problem. And that's why I like to think of some of these things in my mind, some scenarios that may come up, because I think that leads to a better conclusion and gives the supervisors some ability to be more creative in the future.
If we can do that, if we can create some path, some methodology as a group without extending this into a 5-year program, I think, and I think it's worthwhile. I don't know that we can, but we're here to try. And if we are successful in developing a bit of a methodology for them to use, so be it. And it'd be worth the effort that we're putting into it. We may or may not be able to do that. It's all in the kind of where we get in the next month or two. I
Cheryl
think
has
we're
her
going
hand
to
up.
put closure on this at a certain point X. So if that is one of our requirements, then maybe you ought to take and do a position paper on just how you feel, the type of things that need to be thought of in a sequential way for future issues that might come up. I mean, because you're on top of it, so maybe you can write some ideas.
I'd be
I'm
glad
sure-
to.
I'm sure you can.
Bob, Cheryl
Yes,
has her hand
Carol,
up.
I thought you were cleaning your screen. Cheryl, are you,
Yeah. Can we just also, if they have the time, kind of figure out how many spaces are behind the condos, behind the duplexes that could be in use that are not being used, maybe the way they should be? Can we get a sense of that?
I don't know. Let me ask. I think we need to ask Mark. I mean, we have the area, but we would have to scale it. Just, do a scaled drawing to say you could pull in 6 spaces here or whatever. I don't know. That's kind of an engineering issue that we might have to have someone take a look at the map and scale it.
Yeah.
Are you asking for us to quantify what spaces people aren't using on their properties? Is that what you were asking?
That, just to get a sense of that, yeah. And, if we truly have a parking problem in the village and we have people who are parking on the street that have space in the back, we should know that. And so that we can make that part of our presentation if we want to,
You could probably say potentially this property has 4 or 5 spaces if you pull in, or potentially,
Right,
whether they're using it or not,
right.
and whether the regulations allow them to use
Yeah,
it.
it doesn't have to be exact. I think it just would be helpful to have a good sense of that if we wanted to put some kind of regulation in. I don't know that we do, but
You,
So what you're saying is that you're interested, I just want to get this clear. I hear you saying that you have concerns about the possibility of people complaining about wanting to use the street when they have parking in the back. And you want to make sure that we understand what availability these people have, so that we know if you have availability, that you'll be using your availability, and we have to make sure we understand that process. Is that correct?
yes.
Okay.
and we might even be able to do that if we put these maps up on the wall and we use stickies. It's not going to take a scientific survey to tell you that there's potentially 3 or 4 spaces here, period. Before you start moving in and creating parking lots, you just pull off the alley because the alleys are narrow, and you probably could get 4 or 5 people here. And we could do that inventory.
Yeah.
We're looking at the maps.
Right. I mean, we got 5, 6.
If Mark can do the inventory out front and try to get the number.
Yeah.
Bob, I do have an inventory generally of what's available on each property. I think the problem that Cheryl's defining is we don't know what cars on the street belong to which property. So it's hard to know who's not
Right.
using their parking in the back and parking out front.
Yeah, that'd be hard to.
Phone calls about it.
Right, and part of, some of the issue, at least what I've been hearing is that, people are parking on the street and they have space in the back. They have a garage, they have this, they have that, and maybe, I don't know, but the whole time we owned the B&B, we rarely had trouble parking our customers. We had 5, 6 spaces. We could get 5, maybe 6 in the back, depending on how tight they would park. But usually there was parking on the street for them. So, I guess I'm trying to figure out how big the issue is going to be.
I think it's a good database to have here. There's nothing wrong with that. It goes back a little bit to what Frank was talking about. What's our inventory? Where are we now? And what's the need? So,
Right.
Frank has his hand up again.
yeah, I see a beige hand. Is that you, Frank? Go ahead.
That's me.
I know it is.
One of the things I wanted one of these things I wanted to express here, and so that everybody's sitting here and we're trying to do something that is going to be perfect forever. I was told when I first became a supervisor and I went to some of my trainings, especially on zoning and doing ordinances for zoning, don't try to zone forever because the political atmosphere will change. Go 10, 15 years down the road. Don't worry about it after that. because there's going to be different people in with different attitudes, different ideas, and it's going to change everything we decide here today anyway. So try to just so we can get from here to 10 or 15 years down the road. And then, because I'm sure it's going to change in that period.
Well, Frank, just to piggyback on that statement, you've observed what's happened to the economic environment of how to shop since the COVID, and what's happened increasingly over the last 3 or 4 years on how people shop. And the built environment is starting to take a hit, and buildings that we used to count on to do business and retail, people are changing. So that has changed it automatically in our, not necessarily good, but it's
Right.
definitely what you're talking about. Things change quick. Okay, I was starting to talk to Amy about where we're going here. We have a meeting next month, of course. What's our game plan to try to put, you talked about June.
Mhm. Yeah, I think if we can do it, it would be great to be able to go back to the super, because we don't want to drag this committee out. Everyone's time is very valuable. And I think we have a good handle on what our issues are and what we're looking at. So if we could try to maybe make it a goal to get everything back to the supervisors in June and make a presentation to them with recommendations. We talked about that toolkit that we might be able to put together. So basically in March, we would be at the fire hall, talk about the shared parking, look at the mapping, talk with the folks that don't have any off-street parking available to them and hear some of their challenges. And also kind of if we want to bounce some ideas that we have, how those ideas would impact them because they're business owners and they're property owners.
Right.
And April, sit down and remember we had talked about having, you know, like maybe a 2-hour session going a little bit longer and coming up with looking at the recommendations from the small area plan, looking at some other things and starting to physically put together that living, breathing document that I think Barb had talked about last month so that we have an idea of kind of where we want to go and then, you know, use that to refine in May and get something together that we can, you know, maybe we can
Okay.
target. The supervisors have a second meeting every month. They don't meet on that second meeting all the time, but maybe we could target meeting with them on their second meeting date in June if it worked out to present the recommendations to them. And that would be just one, the only focus of that meeting. It wouldn't be, you know, bogged down with the rest of the stuff they have to do every month on their agenda.
Could you possibly put that outline in our minutes so that we are, we have record of that, what we're trying to achieve?
Yep.
So that there'll be kind of like a tentative schedule and what the events will be. So that, and then you'll let us know whether we're meeting next meeting at the fire hall or whether we're meeting at
Yeah.
the township building. I
I'll
think a meeting like what we're talking about is going to be hard to do with Zoom. It's just very
we should
difficult.
Do it in person.
I like when people have stickies and they can walk up to the map and go, bam, this is what I'm thinking, you know. It's more to the point. Okay, good. Well, it's we got one more minute. Any charming ending statements that we can make? I mean, I appreciate what we've gone through. I think Tracy's brought up some of her concerns with, also we've heard other concerns getting database. I'm glad that the township's represented with Todd and Frank and Amy so that we keep it in some context of what we're trying to accomplish. So you've done a good job, and we have a point of closure, which we're going to get into, which will be pretty challenging, but we're going to do it. And it won't be the living document for 15 years, Frank. It'll try to get us through the next event maybe, but I think we have a good committee. We have good representation. So any other comments? If not, we're going to call this meeting adjourned.
Adjourn. So adjourn.
Adjourned. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Good
Thank
night.
you.